We are here in your house in Geneva, and you are at the turning point, an important professional turning point in your career. You're closing a chapter and opening a new one. What's next for the founder of Peace Studies and Peace Practice?
Well, I've done it many times, so it is not that sensational. I actually don't like the word career. It sounds a little bit careeristic. So let me say my work for peace. And it's entering a new phase. Leaving Geneva, which was a very important place to be because of the United Nations, and having very much to do with the UN University in its founding phase and so on. And now concentrating on Spain, packing up here, leaving for Spain, 2 weeks, and then for Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia.
In Kuala Lumpur you will be the head of a Department for Global Peace Studies, is that correct?
I'll be dealing with Mahathir Mohamad, who was 26 years the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and was the one who was able to avert any kind of genocide against Chinese, which happened so catastrophically in Indonesia. And he did it by lifting the Malays up, by positive discrimination in favor of the Malays, so that the enormous envy across economic cultural lines somehow dissipated to some extent, sufficient to avoid genocide. And his big idea is criminalizing war, that war is a criminal activity. Now, war is of course illegal, but criminalize means that effective steps are being taken. So that is the research project of the chair to which I have been appointed. And the chair is called the Tun Mahathir Mohamad Chair in Global Peace Studies, GPS. I like those initials. So that is what is starting. It started actually the 1st of March, but we were focusing on research on the criminalization of war project. And 30th of June, I'm there, ready to start the other aspect of the professorship, the teaching aspect.
Coincidentally, this is 55 years after you founded the academic discipline of peace studies.
Not
is that
quite.
Correct?
I don't put it that way. But I know what you are thinking of. We who were starting peace research in Oslo had found a place to be. And it was Fridtjof Nansens' home called Polhøgda, outside Oslo. And that was one point. Now, if you look at starting in terms of having a building, this was a building. If you look at starting in terms of the first grant was in January '59. And it was to my then wife Ingrid, Ada Galtung, and myself to design a program. Personally, I would say that was much more important than having a building for executing the program. So we designed the program with 5 projects. If you think of starting in terms of getting the sort of idea that something has to be done, that happened already in October 1951. And I've talked about that so many times that I would prefer not to do it again. So it depends on what you mean, I wouldn't say. But it was important to have a building, and we moved in.
If you could just briefly mention those 5 projects you started with, because now, as you've mentioned, you're going into criminalizing war, and whether there is a continuity from those projects to the one that is top.
Not necessarily, but the 5 projects were the following. Number 1, making a survey of theories of conflict and peace. Just simply making a survey. What is there in the field? And it should be transdisciplinary, from psychology to what is wrongly called international relations. It's actually interstate relations. Project number 2 was a very different one. It was to investigate the effect, peace building or not, on Norwegian technical assistance in India, the so-called in the Norwegian fisheries project in Kerala, the southernmost province, state of India. And we had an anthropologist who lived there for a long time, made his PhD and his professorship. And we were looking really at all kinds of aspects of it. Project number 3 was for an historian to do. And the project was, and that comes closer to criminalizing war, was the transition from a violent way of settling interpersonal conflict called duel, and a non-violent way, or shall I say only with verbal violence, called the court process. And that project also led to a person becoming professor of history. I'm talking about Arne Martin Clausen and Sivert Langholm. For the first project it was myself and Ingrid, my then wife. And project number 4 was a kind of interesting one. Norway had invited Khrushchev for a summit meeting in Oslo. Sergei Khrushchev, the head Secretary General of the party in the Soviet Union. And that invitation was cancelled because of something that had happened a time before, and that was Hungary. So I just say Hungary, I'm not going to describe Hungary. And project number 5 was something that Otto Kleinberg, who was very much supporting us, and he came actually with some money, which was an interesting thing. And the project was about public reaction to nuclear armament, disarmament, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. You may remember that in the early 50s, the idea of putting the atom to peaceful use was very important. Now, some people believed in it, some people didn't believe in it, and these were the 5 projects. For us, it was very important that the 5 projects should have a spread in methodology and a spread in disciplines. So the first project in theory was very much reading literature, but covered a whole range from micro to mega. The second project was anthropology, but it was supported by a public opinion study that I conducted myself in Kerala. The third project was a historian's craft. The fourth project was content analysis of newspapers and some public opinion data. And the fifth project was statistical analysis of a comparative study, I think, in 10 countries. In other words, what we wanted, in a sense, to announce was, here we are. It is transdisciplinary, it is transnational, and it is trans-level. Cuts across all levels. And we didn't just want to say that, we wanted to do it.
And to prove it.
Precisely.
How does criminalizing war, your new project, live up to the standard that you set?
Well, it relates to all of it, and it is a logical consequence of the whole thing. We are talking about aggressive war.
Yes.
And we run into the problems of defining aggression. And classical definition is who started, who threw the first stone. Mm-hmm. And that was opposed by who has the most aggressive, if you will, in German, Gesinnung, general attitude, as it built into him. So this is an old problem from the 1930s and so on. Now, we are into that, but we are trying to approach it in a triad of projects. Mm-hmm. So one which is very important to us is not juridical legal at all, but simply to look at the present system, the octagon of major powers in the world. I'm not going to repeat them because they're obvious. And look at one particular thing. What are the conflicts between them and what could they learn from each other? Mm-hmm. How could they cooperate peacefully? In other words, the positive approach. making evident that instead of launching a war to try to settle something, you can simply find out what the conflict is and what not conflict, but the cooperation possibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Contradiction on the one hand, and to coin a term, condiction on the other hand. The second project is to look at other social evils. And the other social evils that we compare with are, of course, slavery and colonialism. Today, if you will, the whole question connection with climate and patriarchy. Social evils. And these are evils that, at least to a large extent, have a human factor behind them. War comes on the list as number 5. What can we learn from the other 4? We have, to a large extent, gotten rid of institutionalized slavery and colonialism. We can learn from that. We are fighting when it comes to the climate, when it comes to patriarchy, but winning in patriarchy quite a lot. What can we learn from that? And how can we put that into war? Then you have the legal aspect. And in the legal aspect, there is something called jus cogens. Call it mandatory law, where the issue is non-disputable, so to speak. And it is built on the right to life and crimes against humanity. So, 2 typical examples will be torture and genocide. There's not much to discuss. It's a question of how to react. Now, we would argue that war is in the same category. And from the Kellogg-Briand Treaty of 1928 through the UN Charter of 24 October 1945, with Article 2.4 very clearly outlawing war, we've had nevertheless quite a lot of wars. And they're usually subterfuges based on pretexts, intervention, to try to make it look as if the state is not involved. Because the UN Charter says that members are states, and it is war among the members that is outlawed. So we're going into all of that, and we are particularly concerned with sanctions. And where sanctions are concerned, there has been a major development recently. In the old days, and they are not very far away, there was the idea that in order to sanction negatively a country that has gone to war, the United Nations, upon the approval and authorization of the Security Council, would launch an attack on that country to make it impossible for them to continue. That presupposes, in principle, if the most aggressive country is also the most militarily powerful country in the world, that the United Nations will have at its disposal, at the center of the world, a capacity, militarily speaking, not only on par with, but superior to the strongest. That leads to a tremendous contradiction in the top-heavy world government, that in itself would be a danger. So they have changed that recently in an interesting way, not sanctioning countries, but sanctioning responsible persons. And the sanctioning would be to close their accounts abroad and to close their possibilities of travel by denying them visa and or making it evident that if they land in any cooperating country, they will be arrested at the airport. In other words, we are in an interesting type of thing. But I repeat, personally, I believe mostly in the positive approach. I think there should be a clear criminalization of aggressive war. I think there should be sanctions. But I think they would be even more biting if for every single war activity there is a clearly promulgated and propagated positive approach to it. As I say when I give talks in the US about it, from victory orientation to solution orientation. Now that slogan has actually caught on, and has caught on actually at 2 very crucial points. In the US, at the top, dealing with foreign policy and military policy.
You won't say anything further about those 2 spots?
No, I don't want to do that at the time being. I see this as a process, as a very pragmatic process. I want to enter into dialogue with them, to explore how they look at it. There is, of course, a US doctrine right now by Obama, the present president, of necessary war.
Mm-hmm.
There is a cultural violence factor that is very important to many people, that the war is built into the human nature. It's innate. And for that reason, as the Germans sometimes say, the Krieg ist ein Naturgesetz. The war is a law of nature. Well, I wouldn't blame the nature. I find human beings capable of the most horrible and most wonderful things. So the question is, what are the circumstances that reduce the horror and bring out the wonders?
With wonders you mean the capacity to be peaceful?
Precisely.
Yeah.
To be peaceful and to engage in peaceful activity. And as you may know, I have been working for many years on a little formula.
Exactly.
So I identify 4 factors. One of them is, if you will, structural peace. Simply defined as cooperation for mutual and equal. Those are the 2 sticky words, you see, and equal benefit. That goes for a marriage, and it goes for economic activity between North and South, East and West and whatever, and equal benefit. Now exactly what that means can be discussed, but usually it's very clear what unequal benefit means. For instance, patriarchy. For instance, colonialism. For instance, imperialism. All of that. So the second factor is empathy. Understand how others look at the world. It's incredibly important. And it will be across fault lines. For men to understand what the situation, for instance, in their own marriage looks at from the woman point of view and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to build on prejudices and misconceptions, trying to dialogue across the fault lines.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very important. So you have, if you look at the fault lines, the long list of them, religions come up. And I remember from my own efforts to conduct dialogues between Christians and Muslims, that the very basic difference was that Muslims knew a lot about Christianity, among other reasons, because they had been colonized by Christian countries. And people from Christian countries knew and know absolutely next to nothing. They don't even understand the meaning of the word jihad. They use it frequently, and they think it somehow means belligerent activity, and they knew nothing about the 4 stages of jihad, which means that you do your very best to develop, preserve, and protect your faith in Islam. And the 4th stage, if you are attacked, if you are trampled upon, is defensive defense. Now, there are some people who declare jihad too easily. There are mistakes in all camps, also in this camp.
Mm-hmm.
But I just mention it as an example of the importance of empathy. The moment you understand how the world looks across the fence, from the other side of the fence, you have already gained quite a lot. So if you take cooperation for mutual and equal benefit and multiply with your level of empathy, you have already come very far. But look, lo and behold, there are still 2 dangers lurking. And those are the classical sources of violence.
Mm-hmm.
Number 1, trauma. The history of the violence of the past. That comes back to one again and again and again. And don't forget the trauma of the perpetrators. The trauma of having traumatized others. Very high. You can compare Germans and Israelis today, and you can ask yourself, who today is most traumatized inside themselves? And the second one is, of course, conflict. And conflict means that something stands in the way of your goal, because there are some incompatible goals. Somebody else is pursuing something. You yourself may be pursuing something that stands in the way. And if something stands in the way of your goal, the general formula is you are frustration. And frustration does not necessarily lead to aggression. It could actually also lead to apathy, which we may call inward aggression, if you will. However, there is a way out. Solve the conflict and conciliation for the trauma. 4 tasks for peace. Number 1, cooperation, mutual and equal benefit. Number 2, empathy. Number 3, conciliation of traumas. Number 4, resolution of conflicts. Easy for me to say, of course, and to ream it off in a phrase like that. To practice it requires knowledge and skills and training and experience. You don't learn it in a